All right. Having done part A of the assignment, you have a better idea of the possibilities and the complexities of doing observational research. In part B of the assignment, you'll be reflecting on that experience, and you'll have some excellent literature to inform those reflections further. So let's have a quick look at some of the main points made by the authors you're required to read for this particular module. Baker, among other important points, reminds us of the following. Observation is a very old strategy that has been used for generations by researchers, particularly in methodologies like ethnography. An essential characteristic of observational research is that it takes place in the participant's natural environment. Students in their classrooms or on the playground, we're talking about educational research here, parents at a parents' council, administrators in their office, at meetings in various locations and their work around the school and so on. And we could go on. In other words, knowledge is not gained by this research through placing participants in a highly restricted and mediated environment so that variables are easily identified, like doing work in a lab, but rather in the participant's natural context, which is a highly complex environment. The researcher's work takes place along a continuum between observer and participant. Observer only, observer participant, participant observer, and participant only. And Baker goes into quite a bit of detail about what each of those locations means in terms of where the researcher is located and how much interaction that means then between observer and participant. And of course, as you might gather, that kind of interaction increases as you move along the continuum. And of course, these kinds of relationships then may change as the research moves forward. So in 3, the third point she makes is that the researcher's role isn't static, but rather is fluid and will change depending on what is required to more fully understand the insiders, that is, the participants, whose insider knowledge is essential to a more complex and complete understanding of the issue being explored in its natural setting. Indeed, the researcher's observations may raise questions for which other methods are necessary for deeper understanding. They may include interviews, storytelling, arts-based inquiry, narrative inquiry, and so on. So let me give you an example. One of my grad students, I wasn't working directly with her in her research, but she was working with me on a project. So, of course, we talked a lot about her research. And she did a really interesting study where she observed students in much more of a participant observer kind of a role. Got to know that students had some issues around feeling safe in the environments in which they found themselves. So her question was, then, where do you feel safe and why? And that was very important in the context of the particular community where she was doing her work. So what she did was she gave them a disposable camera and asked them to take pictures as they were going about their day and week and month, however long it was that they were doing this, to just take pictures of places where they had a sense of safety, where they felt safe. And using those pictures then as a kind of trigger for the discussion, she was able then to extend her observations by discussing these places that students themselves had identified and having a more in-depth discussion about what it was about that place that made them feel safe. So oftentimes this is what happens. Themes do emerge, and when those themes emerge, then there are other ways of gathering not more complete, but a different kind of information that will provide a more complex picture of what's going on for the researcher. One of the first things the observational researcher may be interested in are recurring patterns of behavior, interactions, or relationships. as Marshall et al. Observed. So let's do a little experiment. I'm going to share a short clip of a downtown scene in a section of Tokyo. It's a section that's kind of a business and entertainment section of Tokyo. And I want you to think about any recurring patterns you may observe, and perhaps even write them down as you're observing as you watch. So what did you observe? Well, at first it feels, as I mentioned earlier, kind of overwhelming. There are so many people, and it's such a kind of narrow space. So you kind of feel almost a bit claustrophobic as they sort of enter that tunnel of stores and entertainment places and so on between those two lines of buildings. So there's that feeling. However, as I watch the crowd, and I've watched this little clip probably 2 or 3 times, so I have the advantage of having done that. But one of the things I notice is that there seem to be 2 groups, 2 main groups at least, from my perspective, and maybe you identified other ones, so it'd be interesting to know what you saw. But from my perspective, I saw people who were intentional in terms of walking through that space. So sometimes they skirted around other people. They seemed to be walking faster than the second group. Oftentimes they had parcels or they had a briefcase or something in their hand, but they seemed to be going somewhere. They seemed to have a clear idea of where they were going, and they were moving with that intention in mind. And then the other group seemed to be a group that was just simply passing through that space to see what they could see. So they were looking up, they were looking around, they were checking out to see, perhaps they were looking for somewhere to go to dinner, or they were looking for a place to go and watch a movie. I'm not quite sure what it was that they were doing, but they seemed to be there to observe as almost as tourists. I don't know whether they were actual tourists, but they were interested in that space in that way. So we have those 2 major groups. But but we get there, and then from that point, I'm not quite sure where I go with those observations. I mean, I might play it again if I had an opportunity, and I might look at the male-female distribution, for example, or I might look at the age, apparent age distribution, and those sorts of things. But there is there's this kind of overwhelming feeling of not being able to record everything that's there. But this is quite normal, because as Marshall et al. Suggest, it's impossible to record and analyze everything encountered. So as a researcher, we make choices, which means privileging some aspects of the social life we're observing and also bracketing out other aspects. So, and that's an important observation, because what might that mean for our findings? Well, one thing it means is that researchers need to be self-reflective, so they are aware of their own prejudgments and ideological preferences. Self-awareness and self-reflection are necessary both in the design and analysis of findings or research. Will simply become a replication of the researcher's worldview and the status quo that researcher brings to their observations, often and this is where it becomes problematic, often to the detriment of the disadvantaged and oppressed. So when we think back to that clip, what was it that we missed? Why did we miss it? Is it because from our own experience, we were kind of overlaying our own experience on what we were observing? And that's, perfectly understandable. But in doing that, we have to be reflective about what that experience is, so that we become more open to the experiences that we may be less familiar with when we're observing. So these are some of the things that observational researchers need to be aware of. Certainly making a decision about what data to gather and how and when doing observational research is a challenge. But as Marshall et al. See this as a necessary challenge and an important step in the process of observational research. They refer to the early stage of observational research as the discovery stage. That's certainly the stage that you were in when you were doing part A of the observation assignment, for example. You're looking for general impressions. We're hanging out, even if you're hanging out watching a video, you're hanging out, but purposefully. You're trying to create meaning in order to discover broad areas of interest, maybe some outlier events, similarities or patterns of behavior, as well as differences. And you make note of that as you're observing what it is that you're observing. And that's why time is important. In 1.5 minutes or whatever it was that we were watching the video, that's not nearly enough time to really start to get to that point where you can really clearly identify or feel comfortable identifying those kinds of patterns. But after a half hour of watching, you have a much better sense of what those patterns tend to be. The next step is the refinement of our observations based on our findings in the discovery stage. And at this point, we are working toward clearer goals for our observation. So up here, we may not have a particular goal. We may have a general goal, but we don't have a particular goal. Down here, we know more about what it is that we're going to find. And so we're able then to establish more efficient data collection strategies, such as checklists, for example, or we may record key behaviors, the context of the observations, and so on. And we might even do some electronic gathering of information using the camera on our phone or a video camera or whatever. And of course that requires permissions and so on, but that may be something that you would do. We can also start developing field notes that enable us to add details such as relevant context details, particular activities that are relevant to behaviors, and so on. And I'm trying to think now, I think it's in the Baker article where they make an outline of the kinds of notes that you might be making in your field notes. And that's a really helpful section. At this point, we may also be developing some related questions that require exploration more thoroughly through additional methods such as interviews, document searches, and so on, as we discussed before. The ethical issues in observational research are complex, and they're complex because of the interrelatedness of the role of the researcher and the participants, and where you are on that continuum. Once the researcher feels that they've collected a rich body of data in relation to their research question and they're ready to organize and analyze their data, doing so may raise some significant ethical dilemmas that the researcher needs to be prepared for. So this is part of the preparation of the research or the researcher as they look towards the role they're going to be playing and the kinds of things that they're going to be gathering. So depending on your level of participation on the observer-participant continuum, you may observe behavior or events that raise significant ethical questions. And here, Labrey, who's cited in Baker, suggests that oftentimes in our research, we may not reveal all to the participant. We may reveal what we need to in order to be able to work ethically with them, but we may not reveal everything. So practices of strategic deceit, as he calls it, the tactical use of withholding information, are not unusual strategies in research, because if that were to be revealed, then the participant may not be forthcoming to the degree that we need them to be. And making a conscious decision about who will read about the study's findings can follow the participant observer in the community long after an outsider has moved on to other research projects. So you go home, you're doing your analysis, and you know that those people back there are going to be reading what you're writing. And that has a kind of ethical force, or at least it should have. Sorry about the typos. These are the risks that should be negotiated and carefully calculated by the insider participant observer before the study begins. So all of this, particularly if you're going to be using any of these, needs to be carefully thought about, because at some point the rubber is going to hit the road, so to speak, and you're going to need to make a decision about how that might be taken up by the participants. You may, as you're going through your data, or even before you start going through your data, be aware of dangerous or illegal activities that may be revealed by the findings that you have. You may find unflattering information about people and the kinds of activities that they engage in. What do you do about that? So these are ethical questions that need to be carefully thought about. Now, for a novice researcher, this will be done usually along with their supervisor, who has more experience in dealing with these kinds of issues. So don't worry about these things. These are workable, but they're nevertheless things that you need to be aware of, that you might be thinking about if you were doing observational research. This is an interesting one as well, because this is not something that we think about in research, but leaving participants at the end of data collection can be complex, particularly, again, depending on the degree of interaction that there was between participant and observer. Are you just going to love them and leave them? You know, you're, okay, I'm done, out of here. Or is there a better way? And Baker talks about, you know, moving out of that situation more gradually if there are deep relationships that have been developed over time. Sometimes people are in a community working with that community for weeks or even months, sometimes years. And so, you know, that then has to be factored into the leaving of the project. Analysis, as we mentioned up here, may compromise relationships built when collecting data. And this is particularly the issue, for example, when an Indigenous scholar goes into their own community and does research in their own community. That's something that needs to be thought about carefully. And the kind of quid pro quo issues that come up around going into a community, gathering information through observation, through interviews, and all kinds of other things, and then leaving that community with that information. Sometimes, depending on the kind of information, researchers have done that and have monetized that information, or have gained, you know, a stellar reputation because of that information, but have, you know, the people in the community, nothing has changed for them. And that can create resentment, and, you know, very understandably so. And when you look, I think it's in module 2 or 3, we talk about ethics. And there are some really excellent videos and articles about working in Indigenous communities that take on some of these questions in really important ways. So we'll revisit that, which is something to think about. So observational research has the potential to build understanding in very deep ways, even transformative ways, but it is a deeply human engagement that can be ethically challenging. A researcher needs to be thoughtful and aware of the potential ethical issues that may emerge before they complete their work, or even as they publish their work, so that a researcher is more likely to respond to the ethical challenge in a wise and ethical way. So don't be afraid of this kind of work, but rather be thoughtful, reflective, and move forward with the work in a way that reflects that thoughtfulness. So I hope this has opened up at least some ideas. The readings, of course, extend much further than this. This gives you some idea of some of the main thoughts that some of the researchers, the authors put forward, and I hope that it's helpful to you. All the best.